Well, hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to be with you guys today as we start week 2 of our teaching series called The Art of Neighboring. Last week we talked about the Bible's greatest commandment. You can find it in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. It's the one where Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind." And then he adds, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself." It's that second part of that commandment that we're going to focus on in this series. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Let me ask you a simple but challenging question. How's that going for you? If you could rate yourself on like a scale of 1 to 10, how well would you say that you're loving your neighbors? And I'm talking about your literal neighbors, the people in the apartment complex next door or right on your same street, the ones living in your neighborhood. How well are you loving them? Well, don't be too hard on yourself. There's a reason why Jesus had to continuously remind us about this essential command. Because most of us, if we're honest, well, we struggle with being a loving neighbor. I remember when my wife and I were looking to buy our first home back in 2009. We looked at many homes and put many offers in and kept getting rejected. And then there was one home that just stood out above the rest. Well, we put in our best offer. And I remember waiting a few days in anticipation to see if we would get accepted. And what I would do is I'd go by as I waited every morning and I'd park across the street. Creepy, I know. But I would sit there and I would pray over the home. And I would beg God to give us the house. Please, God, if you could just allow our offer to be the one that rises to the top of the pile and gets accepted, then we'll dedicate this home to your glory and for your ministry. And then I would dream of being the best neighbor on the block, the most loving neighbor I could be, hosting Bible studies, block parties, front yard barbecues, doing random service projects for neighbors, mowing people's lawns, inviting people to church, telling people about how awesome Jesus is. Well, turns out God answered my prayer. We got the home, but the best, most loving neighbor part, that didn't go as planned. We lived in the house for 5 years. And in that time, we hosted 0 block parties, 0 Bible studies, 0 front yard barbecues. I mowed 0 people's lawns besides my own, and I invited 0 neighbors to church. And the saddest part of all is, at the end of the 5 years we lived there, I actually only knew one of my neighbors' names. I remember pulling away from that home when we moved out in the U-Haul and just thinking to myself, how did this happen? Why did I never reach out and love my neighbors? Since then, I've lived in 3 different neighborhoods. And I have to be honest, I've done maybe a little bit better, but not much. So my question is, why? Why is it so easy to dream about loving our neighbors, yet so hard to live it out? Well, if you're anything like me, then it all comes down to one of the most repeated topics in the Bible: fear. I want to live out the words of Jesus and be this loving neighbor, but fear prevents me from doing it. So let's talk about some common fears that stop us. Maybe the most common is safety. I want to love my neighbors, but honestly, I just don't know if it's safe. You know, that guy next door, he kind of gives me the creeps. He never smiles, he never waves back, he always seems grumpy. I don't know if I could trust him. Or that lady across the street, she's always yelling, she's always mad, she's always upset. The other day she yelled at someone for parking too close to her house. I can't reach out to her. She's mean. She'll yell at me too. Or what about that kid who always drives too fast or plays his inappropriate music way too loud, or that house down the street that looks neglected or abandoned or creepy or scary, or the one that smells like marijuana. Kids, stay away from that house. And the news, it doesn't help us here either, right? We're bombarded with story after story of people who do horrific things. And the sad part is, the news is real. Those stories are real. There are some people in our world that do evil things. But the problem with this constant news cycle in our faces is it makes us feel like there's awful people all around us. All of a sudden, we think we're going to be the next story on the 7 o'clock news. And before you know it, we've gotten 2 alarm systems, 3 deadbolts, 2 guard dogs, and we've locked ourselves and our children inside our homes so that we could feel safe. Well, another fear that keeps us from loving our neighbors is the fear of rejection or just the fear of awkwardness. What if we reach out to try and love our neighbors, but it's awkward or they reject us? I'll admit, this fear is really big for me, probably because I'm an introvert. Earlier this year, our lawnmower broke, and so our front yard was just getting out of control. And my wife came home one day and she just said, "Clint, you got to do something about this. Why don't you go next door, knock on the neighbor's door, and ask to borrow their lawnmower?" You guys should have seen my face when she suggested this. I was like, what? I can't just go knock on their door and ask them to borrow a lawnmower. First of all, who knocks on doors anymore? They'll probably think I'm trying to sell them something. I mean, that's awkward. Besides, what if they don't have one, or what if theirs is broken too, or what if it's out of gas, or what if they're afraid of COVID? Do I go over there with a mask on and gloves? That gets even more weird. As you can tell, my fears, they kept me inside of the comforts of my own home. Well, God is a sense of humor, guys. I kid you not, a few days later, I looked out my window and our neighbor was mowing our lawn. He didn't ask, he just started doing it. And not only that, after he mowed our lawn, he pulled out a hedge trimmer and just started in on our overgrown bushes. It was like God was just throwing me this softball. Okay, Clint, are you ready now? Are you ready to go outside and get to know your neighbor? Or do you need me to present an even easier opportunity? But here's the deal, awkwardness and rejection, they're real fears that we struggle with. Okay, now some of you guys are like, "Oh, Clint, that's not me. I'm not an introvert, I'm an extrovert. I know all of my neighbors' names. I know all their faces. I don't struggle with those fears." Okay, well, maybe you struggle with this next one, time. Have you ever loved a neighbor, have you ever not loved a neighbor because it just is gonna take too much time? I had this neighbor once who loved to talk. And I don't mean the guy who says hi and just waves all the time. I mean the guy who corners you and just doesn't stop talking. Even though you're giving him all the polite social cues, okay, I'm opening my car door, the conversation is ending, oh, you're still talking. Okay, now I'm getting inside my car and you're still talking. All right, well, now I'm closing the door and I see that you're still talking. Yeah, that guy. I gotta admit, that neighbor was easier to avoid than to love. Because loving him meant giving him time. And we're in a hurry. Now, I could go on and on and on about fears that keep us inside the comforts of our home rather than go outside where we know that God is calling us to go. And guys, this isn't new. Fears have always kept God's people from going where He's calling them to go. Maybe the best example of this is in the book of Numbers, when the Israelites are in the wilderness on the brink of the promised land. But instead of going into this place that God had given them, this place that God had promised them, flowing with milk and honey, they instead let fear stop them. The story, it goes like this. The Israelites, they choose 12 spies to go into this promised land, just to see what it's like, just to check out the landscape, the food, the living conditions, size up the people, just double check that God was right about all this stuff. I know He's God, but let's just make sure. Well, the spies, they go in and then they come back out with some good news and some bad news. The good news is the food is awesome. The landscape is beautiful. It's all just like God had described. But the bad news is the people there are like giants. They're scary. They're powerful. If we go inside, they will destroy us. You see, 10 of the 12 spies, they came back with this fear-driven report, and they told the Israelite people not to go where God had clearly called them to go. Only 2 of the spies had faith. That's Joshua and Caleb. Well, unfortunately for the Israelites, they followed their fear instead of their faith, and they decided to stay in the wilderness. And that's where they wandered around for 40 more years, until every one of those 10 fearful spies died. And that's when the Israelites decided to try again. Let's go back into this promised land and see what we can see. Only this time, the spies, they saw something completely different. They met a lady named Rahab, and she told them this in Joshua chapter 2, verse 9. She said to them, this is the scriptures, it says, "I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a greater fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord, your God, is God in heaven above and on earth below." Wow. Talk about a turn of events, right? The Israelites' perception had been wrong all along. They had always feared their neighbors, but the truth was it was their neighbors who were afraid of them because of the size of their God. And see, that's the lesson here. That's the point in this story. Our fears are oftentimes based on false assumptions. We've created these giant-sized assumptions in our mind that keep us from loving our neighbors. And most of the time, they're just not true. So this is what I want us to do right now. I want you to think about that neighbor that you know that God is calling you to love. Got it? Okay, now think about the fear that keeps you from loving them. Now ask yourself, is that fear based on an assumption, or is that fear based on truth? If it's true, if it's a legit fear, then be discerning. If you really do live next door to a drug dealer, maybe don't send your kids over to deliver them cookies in the middle of the night. God calls us to be wise and discerning as well. But chances are, most of our fears are based off false assumptions. We assume that person is going to reject us. We assume that person is going to waste our time. We assume that kid down the street is going to bully our kid if we allow them to play together. But what if we asked God to replace our fearful assumptions with His perfect love? 1 John 4:18 says, "Perfect love casts out fear." I love that verse. Love conquers fear. See, fear says, don't reach out to that neighbor because they're angry and they might blow up on you too. But love casts that false assumption out. Love says, no, that person's anger is actually the reason why we need to go and love them, because no one else is. Their anger is actually their cry to be loved. Fear says, don't stop and talk to that chatty Kathy. It's a waste of time. But love casts that false assumption out. Love says, no, that's actually why we need to stop and give them our time and listen to them, because no one else is. That's why they keep talking, because they're desperate for someone to listen, someone to care, someone to love them. So let's end with this question. Who is it? Who is that neighbor that God is calling you to love? And what fear is standing in your way? Let's ask God this year, church, in 2020, maybe the craziest year that any of us have ever lived in the middle of a global pandemic, to allow His love to drive out our fear so that we can show our neighbors the same love that God has shown us. We'll see you guys next time.